Although the Sun is currently nearing the end of its 11-year solar magnetic activity cycle, NASA has identified and confirmed a 3-day period in June which will present sharply increased solar activity. Officials state these are the most powerful readings they have ever observed. The uptick in activity creates the probability of multiple solar flares that will likely spawn the largest solar storm in recorded human history. With a high degree of confidence, the space agency predicts weather and communications satellite failures, widespread electrical grid failures, long-term food, drug, and fuel shortages, as well as economic turmoil. The Centers for Disease Control has released an internal impact report to all of its departments concerning the probable solar events in June. On page 32 of the report, the following projection is presented. Quote, within 60 days of the predicted catastrophic solar storm, because of general infrastructure and local government breakdowns, internal facility protection mechanisms and protocols will likely degrade to a level where high probability exists of containment failure. The failure will expose the public to many, if not all, the pathogens and contagions in current isolation. The potential for recombination of the most viral contagions into new and unknown forms is high. Preparedness protocols will be completely ineffective in such case. Any CDC-affiliated personnel will have the opportunity to resign prior to August 1, 2017. After that date, all CDC facilities will operate under quarantine lockdown protocols for the duration of the event. End quote. When it concerns, quote, recombination into unknown forms, end quote, perhaps the CDC's tongue-in-cheek campaign back in 2011 regarding zombie preparedness was no joke after all. As part of the classified report of June's increased solar activity, NASA has determined that said activity is likely the result of an inbound asteroid due to arrive at Earth between September and October 2017. The asteroid is more than 6 miles wide, but no exact size was indicated in the report. Impact speed is estimated in excess of 50,000 miles per hour, and the impact itself is considered to be an extinction-level event. The impact epicenter is projected to be near the 42nd parallel in central Italy, close to Rome. The report goes on to outline the effects of the impact and sounds more like science fiction than reality. Global atmospheric disintegration, tsunamis, supervolcanoes and earthquakes, the whole 9 yards. Subsequent research has led to the most troublesome revelation of all. The asteroid identified in the report is no asteroid at all. It has been determined that the object is the massive planet known in the Sumerian and Babylonian mythology as Nibiru. Confirmation for this determination has been found all over YouTube. Therefore, its veracity is obviously confirmed. In fact, all over the internet, the viewer can find one report after another about the arrival of Nibiru in September or October of this year. With it being all over cyberspace, it has to be true, right? No, not right. What you just watched is an example of the fear-mongering and ludicrous predictions you see plastered all over social media every day. To date, there are at least a few thousand apocalyptic predictions specifically regarding Nibiru. They span all the way back to the 1990s with old-school fearmonger Nancy Lieder. Many of you watched Nibiru Hijack 2 when it first came out. For those of you that missed that one, there is a link in the description below. However, it's worth our time to review a small excerpt. Perhaps the original and arguably still most infamous hijackers of Nibiru was Nancy Lieder. For various reasons, the archive will quote directly from Wikipedia, which is not a normal occurrence but appropriate here. Quote, "The idea was first put forward in 1995 by Nancy Lieder, founder of the website ZetaTalk. Lieder describes herself as a contactee with the ability to receive messages from extraterrestrials from the Zeta Reticuli star system through an implant in her brain. She states that she was chosen to warn mankind that the object would sweep through the inner solar system in May of 2003, though that date was later postponed, causing Earth to undergo a physical pole shift that would destroy most of humanity. The prediction has subsequently spread beyond Lieder's website and has been embraced by numerous internet doomsday groups, most of which linked the event to the 2012 phenomenon. The name Nibiru is associated with the works of the ancient astronaut researcher Zecharia Sitchin and his interpretations of Babylonian and Sumerian mythology. He denied any connection between his work and various claims of a coming apocalypse." End quote. Two things here. One, it seems that Lieder was the grandmother of the modern social media contingent of Nibiru fearmongers and doomsdayers. For the last 20 years, this group has predicted one date after another as Nibiru's cataclysmic return. Just as stated in the quote, Lieder's May 2003 date was repeatedly revised. So also are the myriad of dates that pop up in the groups on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and all the other platforms. The second thing is the last sentence of the quote. "Anyone who is a genuine proponent of the ancient astronaut hypothesis knows full well that Sitchin did not believe Nibiru was due back anytime soon. A doomsdayer does not pay attention to such pesky facts." The group that is perverting Sitchin's work for personal gain are the fearmongers and doomsdayers who are in the business of producing clickbait for ad revenue and or selling survival merchandise. They intentionally utilize Nibiru-centric groups to post outlandish predictions and just keep changing the dates. Just a few clicks into their profile and one can often find a link to some type of product the person is promoting, and it is often related to survival. That is, of course, if the person hasn't already just blatantly posted a link to their product directly into the group. So, problem one is that the level of this group's greed relies on the gullibility of the pop culture, which seems to be infinite. Problem two is this extends beyond gullibility and actually induces fear among certain folks. The terms doomsdayer and fearmonger were not casually chosen to describe this group, as both terms get straight to the point. So what can any particular person do about it? Well, knowing the full picture can help a lot. See, the more people who are informed that not only are these predictions and sightings of Nibiru nothing more than rubbish, but they are also inflicting immeasurable harm to the credible pursuit of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, then the more people who will not perpetuate the phenomenon. So why is the archive back on the topic, you may ask? Well, as you can see from the previous clip, a couple years ago, the archive produced a video that explained how fear-mongering about Nibiru would ultimately work to delegitimize the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and by extension, one of its founding scholars, Zecharia Sitchin. And voila, it happened in early January 2017. The Washington Post published a piece titled, "Will the Mysterious Shadow Planet Nibiru Obliterate Earth in October? No." So let's take a brief walk through. Quote, "If all goes according to wild conjecture, planet Earth and the planet Nibiru are set to collide in the autumn. Twin cosmic shooters in a game of apocalyptic marbles. Nibiru is playing for keeps, bringing sinkholes, firestorms, and the general annihilation of life as we know it. As with many conspiracy theories, though, this one has a fatal factual flaw. The closest thing that Nibiru has had to an existence was a cameo in a 2013 Star Trek film. There is not, in reality, a planet called Nibiru boldly zooming through our solar frontier." End quote. This article is a good example of the quality of media nowadays, or the lack thereof. While in fact one could argue that belief in Nibiru is conjecture, an equally valid and scientific argument exists that it is not conjecture. To state the unequivocal non-existence of Nibiru without a shred of evidence by using the same level of conjecture the writer just ridiculed is hypocritical at the very least. It goes on, quote, "The fictitious shadow planet, according to Nibiru believers, is flung from the outskirts of the solar system dangerously close to Earth every 3,600 years. And like its mysterious elliptical orbit, the heavenly body has a way of circling back in vogue. The most recent incarnation of Nibiru, as British tabloids and AOL News noted at the beginning of January, pencils in the apocalypse for October 2017. The Plymouth Herald pointed to David Mead, author of the book Planet X, the 2017 arrival, as the source of the current stir. Devastation, Mead crowed, will come in the form of Nibiru and several other tough-to-detect planets which circle a brown dwarf called Nemesis. The planets, traversing large oval paths, remain hidden in far-off space until they come close in on Earth. And as roomy as those $25,000 a pop doomsday bunkers in South Dakota may be, concrete and steel walls would offer little solace in the face of total planetary vaporization." End quote. Moving beyond the author's feeble attempt at humor, we can see he wastes little time conflating separate theories, begging the question that Nibiru is a brown dwarf system. First, this is no mistake. In order for the writer to use a scientific rebuttal later in the article, this false premise needed to be established. Second, Mr. Mead, the author of the book in question, is in the position of not only being the primary source of the fear-mongering on this occasion, but also an inaccurate one. In other words, he created the fodder for this writer. If the name Nibiru rings a bell, perhaps it flickered across your path as one of the many possible eschatons of 2012 tied to bogus Mayan end-of-the-world prophecies. As a concept, though, Nibiru predates both the 2012 hubbub and Mead's doomsday scenario. Zachariah Sitchin, a former journalist and shipping industry executive, proposed the idea of Nibiru in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, Book 1 of the Earth Chronicles. The other 6 chronicles include titles like The Stairway to Heaven and The End of Days, in which Sitchin wondered if the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed via nuclear bomb. Sitchin fancied himself an expert in the ancient Sumerian language. He determined that pre-cuneiform Sumerian documents included references to a planet called Nibiru. Never mind that the term Nibiru was an object in Babylonian, not Sumerian, astronomy. End quote. The archive wonders if the writer fancies himself an expert in sarcasm with that last comment. Here's our attempt. Never mind that Babylonian astronomy is a close derivative of Sumerian astronomy. Quote, "From his translation sprang a plot out of a second-rate L. Ron Hubbard novel. On Nibiru lived aliens similar in stature to humans except half again as tall. About 500,000 years ago, the rangy population of Nibiru decided to mine gold in Africa, landing a group of ancient astronauts on Earth. Here, the Nibiru astronauts genetically altered the native Earthlings, that is, the ancestors of you and me, into an exploitable working class. This is in the text. I'm not making it up," Sitchin told the New York Times in 2010, a few months before his death at age 90. They wanted to create primitive workers from the Homo erectus and give him the genes to allow him to think and use tools. Sitchin was opposed to the idea that Nibiru would come close to Earth in 2012. That would happen 1,000 years later, he said. Now, notwithstanding another unprofessional eruption of immature ridicule at the beginning, the last 2 paragraphs are essentially correct. Quote, "The concept mutated toward doomsday in 1995 when a self-avowed alien contactee and psychic Nancy Leader warned about a collision with Nibiru on her site Zeta Talk. As outlandish as the prospect might seem, the concept took hold. In the estimation of NASA astrophysicist David Morrison, there are some 2 million websites devoted to what happens when Nibiru meets Earth. Well, the writer gets credit for pointing out that Leader did indeed mutate the hypothesis. Nevertheless, this goes to demonstrate what we talked about in Nibiru Hijack 2. It shows how the fear-mongering about Nibiru even 20 plus years ago is still having a harmful effect today. It gives writers like this a rich source of debunking material. Quote, if Nibiru had an anti-prophet, Morrison might very well fit the bill. Morrison has become something of an expert Nibiru debunker. It was a skill built up out of exposure. Morrison said in a July 11 interview he was fielding 5 email queries to NASA about Nibiru daily. Morrison elaborated on the subject in a 2011 video. There are no pictures or astronomical observations of Nibiru, but a planet 9 months away from crashing into Earth, cruising within the inner solar system, would be visible to the naked eye. At a 2009 conference in California, Morrison pointed out no one could hide Nibiru if it existed. What's more, an elliptical orbit that passed by every 3,600 years would alter the paths of Mars and Earth. Well, okay, first thing, notice the precondition of the first sentence. Quote, but a planet 9 months away, end quote. Yes, the archive totally agrees, and everyone believing their sundogs and sun flares are Nibiru do not understand the level of ignorance they are displaying. Second thing, notice Morrison says the elliptical orbit would alter the paths of Mars and Earth, but then curiously does not rule out that is exactly what has happened. Quote, that Earth has a moon is a damning mark against Nibiru too. The gravitational pull of a rogue planet probably would have stripped the moon away completely, the astrophysicist said. As for a hidden brown dwarf star like Nemesis, its effects would be even more dramatic. Well, here, as is usually the case in astrophysics, Morrison states his probability. The archive says his probability because we are willing to bet that his math did not include algorithms for multiple natural satellite interactions during a potential pass or passes of Nibiru. There is also the point he already made above that the paths of Earth and Mars would be altered. Well, the ancient astronaut hypothesis states that when Tiamat was struck millions of years ago, its path was indeed altered. That could easily mean that subsequent passes of Nibiru were markedly further away from the inner planets. Quote, more plausible, but not at all a harbinger of end times, is a possible Planet X. The name Planet X denotes a suspected planet. Before astronomer Clyde W. Tombaugh confirmed the existence of Pluto in 1930, the dwarf planet was referred to as Planet X. In January 2016, researchers at the California Institute of Technology published a paper in Astronomical Journal hypothesizing the existence of a massive perturber that altered the orbits of rocky bodies and dwarf planets on the fringes of our solar system. End quote. Well, the archive will give the writer credit here also. He does differentiate between Nibiru and Planet X, which is rare. But it is a point the archive has been making for some time now. And that is this. Just because you believe you see something in the sky does not mean you need to immediately jump to Nibiru. There are many other candidates for your observation before you ever get to Nibiru. But as you know, for the fearmongers, there really is only one choice they can use to get the clicks, and that is Nibiru. Quote, were a Planet 9 to exist, and its existence remains at this point speculation, the closest it would come to the Sun would be 200 astronomical units. 1 astronomical unit is equal to the distance from the center of the Earth to the center of the Sun. Neptune, the farthest planet from the Sun, sits at a distance and not at all apocalyptic 30 AU. End quote. Well, without a direct reference provided by the writer as to the closest distance to the Sun being 200 astronomical units, it becomes difficult to classify such assertion as anything other than speculation also. Unfortunately, this is yet another example of the harm inflicted on the ancient astronaut hypothesis by a fearmonger writer and an out-of-ideas media. The understanding of Nibiru to the general public has become synonymous with an apocalyptic event that can be all too easily ridiculed. It manages to completely override the legitimate questions about what the Sumerians were really talking about in their legacy. The archive will step up front and center to call bullshit on this. Bullshit on this writer ever knowing the depth and extent that Sitchin went to in his decades of research. The archive calls shame on both fearmongers and media hacks executing the equivalent of a drive-by ridicule of Sitchin's work when neither could possibly hope to ever have an equivalent importance to human history. Since the fearmongers produce videos and the pop culture consumes the same thing repeatedly regarding the Nibiru apocalypse, the archive thought it fitting to repeat its declaration and restatement on the matter from years ago. Quote, the archive rests its argument with the man that actually identified Nibiru in the ancient texts and knew more than anyone else about its existence. And of course, that someone is Zacharias Sitchin. In 1992, Robert Harrington and Tom Van Flandering of the Naval Observatory, working with all the information they had at hand, published their findings and opinion that there is indeed a 10th planet, even calling it an intruder planet. The search was narrowed to the southern skies below the ecliptic. Harrington invited Sitchin, having read his book and translations of the Enuma Elish, to a meeting at his office, and they correlated the current findings with the ancient records. The recovered Enuma Elish document, A History of the Formation of Our Solar System and More, says that at the time when Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Uranus, and Saturn were in place, there was a Uranus-sized planet called Tiamat in orbit between Mars and Jupiter. Earth was not in place yet. A large wandering planet called Nibiru was captured into the system gravitationally. As it passed by the outer planets, it caused the anomalies of their moons, the tilting of Uranus on its side, the dislodging of Pluto from it being a moon of Saturn to its own planetary orbit. Its path bent by the gravitational pull of the large planets. First, its satellites collided with the large planet Tiamat, and on a second orbit through, Nibiru collided with Tiamat, driving the larger part of it into what is now Earth's orbit to recongeal as Earth, dragging its moons with it to become our moon with all of its anomalies. The shattered debris of Tiamat's smaller part became the asteroid belt, comets, and meteorites. The gouge of our Pacific basin is awesome testimony to the collisional event. Nibiru settled into a 3,600-year elliptical retrograde orbit around our Sun, coming in through the asteroid belt region between Mars and Jupiter at perigee and swinging far out past Pluto at apogee. Harrington acknowledged that his information agreed with all these details, and the maps they each had drawn of the orbits were almost indistinguishable. The current probable location of Nibiru, estimated by both, was the same. Sitchin ultimately concluded Nibiru's orbit to be approximately 3,450 years long, and its last appearance in the year range 520 to 560 BCE. Thus, the next appearance looks to be around the year 2900 AD. Of course, that is not as exciting as Nibiru showing up in the next month or next spring or next October. Nonetheless, that timeline receives mutual agreement from both an astrophysicist and one of the first scholars to translate the word Nibiru. Considering those sources, the archive chooses to adopt this timeline as well. Harrington and Sitchin did not use photos of sundogs or elaborate conspiracy theories to contemplate and derive the position of Nibiru. They used astrophysics and ancient texts that corroborated one another. In conclusion, the viewer may be wondering why the archive chose to speak up on this matter. Well, maybe if Nancy Lieder had decided to call Planet X Tatooine instead of Nibiru, then the archive would have probably remained silent. Instead, she chose to intentionally co-opt a great man's work and pervert its truth. Leader became the original hijacker of Nibiru when she first made the connection between Nibiru and her planet X on her site in 1996. So the original perversion was intentional. Out of that has grown 20 plus years of fear-mongering and ignorance. Granted, that is the archive's opinion. The viewer may be diametrically opposed to that opinion. Even so, the viewer will know why the archive does not condone the perversion of Nibiru into something grossly inaccurate. It does not condone the harm created by those who put forth easily refuted assertions concerning the Nibiru component of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. And finally, it does not condone the use of fear and potential cataclysm for personal gain. This may not be the most exciting or popular position regarding Nibiru, but the archive zealously believes it is the correct one.
Maybe you wish to tell us in a few minutes the nature of those discoveries.
I'd be happy to, and you're absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, the date on here, I was just noticing, is 14 August 1978, which was just about 6 weeks after we discovered the fact that Pluto has a satellite. Once you have a satellite for a planet, you can determine how heavy it is. It turns out Pluto was very much smaller and lighter weight than we had thought, which meant that Pluto has no influence, no appreciable influence on the motions of the planets Uranus and Neptune. At that point, we voiced a hypothesis that this means that there is at least one yet to be discovered planet in the outer reaches of the solar system, and this naturally led directly to you and your interest in what we're doing, and that's when you sent me this book.
You have then postulated the existence or the appearance in some time years ago of a celestial body which you, I think, named in that paper an intruder.
Yes.
Which may have collided with or somehow turned on their side both Uranus and Pluto.
It did a lot more than that, as a matter of fact. In that paper, we hypothesized that this intruder passed very close to Neptune, that it dislodged one of what we then think were many satellites of Neptune, and one of them became the planet Pluto. We actually think Pluto was an escaped satellite of Neptune. This will also take the orbit of Triton, the big satellite of Neptune, and reverse it. We'll take the orbit of the satellite Nereid and extend it outwards. We can produce all of the observed aspects of the satellite system of Neptune plus Pluto's orbit just with this one single intruding planet. One of the things we did in 1978, having made this prediction that there was an additional planet, 10th or 12th, depending on your point of view, but it's the next one, we sort of put our money where our mouth was, as it were. We went out and we started looking for this thing. We've been searching for 12 years for this thing. We've been able to refine the search area somewhat, get it rather narrowed down. We do our predictions based on the observed anomalies in Uranus and Neptune. We actually are currently looking down in the region of Centaurus, which is just south of the constellation Libra, but very close to the area that you've talked about.
I think, Dr. Harrington, you have a pretty good picture, at least in your own mind, of what we are talking about, a big planet, a small planet.
Well, if it is in the kind of orbit that we describe here, it would have to be a planet that would have a mass something like 3 to 5 times the mass of the Earth. This would put it intermediate between the gaseous planets like Uranus and Neptune and the terrestrial planets that we have in the inner part of the solar system. So if this planet turns out to be in a 3,600-year orbit, then its mass will be correspondingly larger. But we're talking about something it's a perfectly reasonable kind of planet. It looks like a good, nice planet, small enough that it's not going to be completely enveloped in gas, so it's perfectly capable of supporting life forms of one kind or another. This one here is a map of the solar system as we know it. The inner planets, this is the orbit of planet Pluto, and this here is the orbit that I have proposed for the 10th planet, and here's where we think it is right about now in its orbit. This is your orbit for the planet, and showing that it would come out of Sagittarius in biblical time, and that once you allow for precession, it would be around into Libra by now.